Hi, welcome to MegaSplat Development Log 23. I think it's 23. So I'm going to be covering things that are in the 1.12 and 1.3 patch because I didn't make videos for those, and talking a lot about what's in 1.14, which is one of the larger updates I've done in a while. So let's talk about some of the old stuff first. I showed off lava in, I think, the last development video, and then somebody on YouTube was like, hey, that looks great, but it looks like the rocks, it's stuff sort of sliding underneath them. Could you get the lava to go around the rocks? And I said, well, we don't really have the right information to make it go around the rocks, but we can cheat. And so the trick is that now, when lava starts to come and flow map up against the rock, it actually slows down around the rock. And so that makes it look like the lava kind of comes around the rock when you look at the overall thing. And so you get a much more interesting flow where it looks, a little nicer and doesn't look like things are sliding under the rock at all. It looks like things are going around. I'm pretty psyched about that. I think it makes a big difference to this. So I also added support for glitter, which is an effect I'm still working on. I'm still trying to figure out a better way to do it. Favorite games for this really is a Sand and Journey, and snow will get these little glints on it that can be quite nice. So here we have some snow. I don't think I have the glitter on right now, so let me turn it on, and I will turn on the snow one. So let's go to snow. This UI is due for some kind of organization to make it easier to find stuff. So you can actually do per text glitter, which gives you a single control over the glitter. And then glitter, when it's computed, is computed the same for all terrains. Here we go, snow glitter. If you have suggestions about how to organize this better, I'd love to hear of it. The list has gotten extremely long. I think there are a lot of esoteric options that could maybe be moved to a different menu. I could probably move all the per texture stuff into its own menu. But that certainly seems like we're getting close to the time where that's going to be worth doing. So I've turned on glitter on the snow, and you can see as I get up close to the snow, you can see these little glints in the snow now. Now there's two types of glitter in the system. Well, depending on how you count it, there's more, because there's per texture glitter, water glitter, and snow glitter. But there's basically static or animated for the glitter. So if you turn it to animated, it uses a few more texture samples, and it kind of munges with the view direction a little bit to create the effect that these glints are sort of moving around and changing a little bit. And so you can see, it might be kind of hard to see on video, especially if your YouTube is deciding to make things low res. But you can see that this is sort of changing over time. The shapes are changing, it's moving a little bit. And you can play with the settings to get that to be more or less predominant. And then it does this sort of wide ocean specular, some people call it, over the area. And we can go into the glitter settings, and we can actually change the shininess, which is the size of that spread. So higher values, you're going to get more of only in the specular versus lower values where it'll appear in more areas. And then the reflectivity here controls sort of the strength of it. The texture itself is basically just two noises in the red and green channel. I have, I think, two example textures here. You can play with this. I'm probably going to change it if I can come up with a better algorithm. This is what a lot of people do for glitter, and I don't really like it. So I'm going to start reading some papers and try to figure out something that's a little bit better. But for now, you know, it does help for certain surfaces to get a slightly better look on snow. So enough about glitter. Let's talk about the new terrain workflow and some of the new shader options. Maybe I'll do the shader options first. So let's talk about those first, I guess. And let's turn off the snow so that snow have a little more area to work with that isn't snow. We'll come back to snow because I added some more options for them too. So I have this new option called Geo Height Texture. You turn this on, and this is something you could do before with the macro texture, but there was a problem. So what this is a very standard technique. You take a gradient like this one here, and you map it vertically on your terrain to create like striations. So you can see these striations here. And you can control the blending amount of this, make it more apparent or less apparent. You can change the scale and offset in world space to slide this around. So, you know, you can move this striping along and get sort of different looks. This always uses a multiply mode, multiply 2x. So basically a value of 0.5 will have no effect. A value lighter than that will make it lighter or darker if it's lower than that. So you could do this before with a macro texture, but the reason I added this is that if you project your macro texture, then things like the snow and water will use the projected UV coordinate. And so therefore, what you'll end up with is smeary looking water and snow that doesn't quite work with it. So yeah, so that was a nice little feature that I've been meaning to put in for a while. Now note you can also have a macro texture along with this. So if you want a tint map or you want a global, you know, fade to macro texture thing, you can still do all of that. And this GeoTexture, you know, it lets you get a lot of variation to landscapes and certain looks like striation that are hard without it. And it's very, very cheap because it's just a little gradient texture, vertical gradient. So I also changed the macro mode slightly. Before you would turn on macro texturing, and you can still go the old way and turn on macro texturing, but now I have this thing called presets. And so I only have 2 of them in right now, which are basically the 2 main things people use the macro texture for. One is tint map, which is basically like, hey, just, you know, take a sample of a texture and tint the whole terrain. And then there's fade to macro, which is basically cross-fading into the terrain texture. So when you set one of these presets, then what it'll actually do is set up your macro texture settings for the given use case that you've requested by choosing this preset. So in this case, we're doing the fade to macro texture thing. So it's turned on macro texture and set us up to blend in that macro texture over time. And so now we go to the macro texture here. We have a fade distance, which we can adjust. And you'll see that as I move out, it's going to crossfade into that texture. This texture was not designed for this terrain, so it looks very weird, but you get the idea. So if you're doing like a crossfade to a LOD of your terrain, you don't have to know all the settings required to do that. You just select the preset and then you're done. Well, you still have to set up your textures and stuff. So I'm going to turn that off. And that's just a usability thing. I felt like, you know, this texture's kind of, I mean, this system's kind of a beast, and that might clean up usability a little for the common use cases. So the other thing I want to talk about, for this I need to turn snow back on. Global snow. Okay, so now we have this snow over our terrain, and the problem I'm trying to deal with is that depending on your snow texture, you know, this is a tiling texture, and so much of MegaSplat is about not ever seeing tiling. right? So why should we see tiling on our snow texture? We shouldn't, right? So rather than using clusters, which have some very specific technical requirements, I put in some more traditional techniques. And you can use either or both of them. There's a distance noise, which you're familiar with the regular distance noise the terrain has. This is one that just affects the snow. And then there's distance resampling, which is a common trick, which is basically just sample the same texture twice and blend it in with a different UV scale. So you can turn on either or both of these. I personally like the distance noise. I think it's super cheap. It's one texture lookup, and you can get quite a lot out of it. So once this is on, we can go down to the snow section here, and you'll see it has a noise texture. And I believe I added a snow noise, or what did I call it? Snow detail noise. So if we select this, we basically have some distances at which this starts. If you'd like this on everywhere, you can just set those distances to 0, and now we'll always see them. And then you have a UV scale. So this is going to be 0.1 means it's going to have 10 of these in each, it's going to be 1/10 the size. So it'll be 10 times larger than the scaling on our regular snow texture. And then you have a strength. And you can see if I turn this up, I get this like patterning, and I probably want to adjust the scale here to something like, I don't know, 0.3. So I get this patterning over my whole thing. And if I turn this back down to something nice, like 0.5, you can see it adds sort of a fluffiness and some shading to the snow and breaks up that tiling. And that's largely because of the texture I've chosen here. You can, use this to get a grittier looking snow, but I've chosen this normal map that, a noise map, which essentially has these big wide areas. And so the first two channels of this, the red and green channels of the normal map, and the third channel is a luminance modifier. So, so that is basically one of the techniques. The other one is the distance resampling, which if you've ever used distance resampling, it just kind of, it's going to sample your textures again and blend it in. So it sort of blurs out your texture a little bit, but does cover up seams really well. So let me turn some of this stuff off because I'm always working in the shipping scenes here. So turn off that GeoTexture. And you notice the GeoTexture correctly responds, like it doesn't cover up the snow, which is what you want. And now we're just going to turn off the snow for now. And let's switch over and talk about the new terrain workflow. So to do that, I'm actually going to leave this copy of Unity, and I'm going to switch into Unity 5.5. I'm going to get rid of this one. And that's just because I have my the data for this project in another copy of Unity. Close this one out. All right, so I've got a very large terrain here. I was playing with another texturing package, and I want to convert it to MegaSplat. And what I learned from doing this was that working with multiple terrains can be very, very painful with MegaSplat. Setting up 20 or 30 of them meant you'd have to click on one, you'd have to convert it, let's just go ahead and convert this back to Unity Standard Shader, and I will show off the new tech. So here we go. We're looking at Unity Standard Shader, which is, the big blurry mess that it is. But we have this massive terrains made out of what looks like about 20 terrains. In MegaSplat, one thing that's nice, you can always just select the root object here, and then the terrain painter will work on everything as if it's one thing. And so basically it says, hey, this isn't set up for MegaSplat, would you like me to set it up? So I hit setup, and what it's going to do is it's going to make a new shader for me and a new material. But because I'm working on 20 of these landscapes at once, what it's actually going to generate, which you can see down here already, is it's made a splat control and parameter texture for each terrain chunk, but it's only generated one shader and material for us to work on. And that's because we want all of these terrains in our selection to have the same materials. If we want to change, what some texture property, we don't want to have to edit 20 of these. And so this makes this really easy. So let's just go ahead and set up our shader here. And I definitely want to use my normal SAO packing. And 2-layer. And what else do we need? Let's just keep it simple for now. I'm going to set these to like 20. And going to add my MegaSplat diffuse. And then I'm going to add my MegaSplat normal SAO. Here we see the terrain. Now normally it wouldn't come in all converted like this, but I've already done the conversion. And what it actually did when we set up all these terrains at once was it added this component called the MegaSplat Terrain Manager. So now every terrain has one of these. If you have an old MegaSplat file, once you click on the terrain and go into the terrain painter, it's going to add one of these. And what this does is it says, hey, here is the template material that I use. This is like the material on disk. And then it says this is the control texture and a parameter texture if I have one. And if you look on the regular way to get to the material, you'll see it's set up to custom and it's using what looks like our material. But if we double click on it, this material is now grayed out. We cannot edit it. And that is because it's it's an instance that we've made just for this terrain. And what we really want to do is edit the original one on disk, not the instance. So if we go back to selecting one of our terrains, we can go down here and we can actually double click on this material. And now we can edit, even though we have 20 terrains here, when we make an edit to this, let's just change the interpolation contrast. You'll see it updates on all of them. If I change, the size, or let's just do something a little more drastic so we can see it off in the distance. Let's turn on snow, I guess. If I turn on snow, it's going to recompile that shader, and then it's going to apply those changes to the entire map. And you can see the entire map has got this super low level snow here with no texture because it's not set up for it. And so we can just get our, I think it's Ice Snow 3 that I like to use. Snow, and we can go adjust any of these properties. And even though this is, we're looking at like a whole bunch of different terrains here, they're all adjusting as if they are one terrain, right? So we can fly around this whole scene. And everything is textured and updated all at once as if this was one material. So that makes the workflow a whole lot nicer. I'm really happy with this. I think it's going to work out really well for anybody working on multiple terrains. And let's talk about the terrain converter, because I did a bunch of work on that. And we can look at what this thing looks like in a Unity shader. So one easy way we can do that is we can go to all these terrains, and we can just, it won't let us switch them back, but if we delete this MegaSplat terrain manager, then you can see what the Unity one looks like. And there's some grass here. It's all super blurry, blurs together a whole lot. Let's go to Terrain Painter. And there's a very easy way to update these again. If you select them all. And so we ripped off our component. Well, here, I'll just undo it. I meant to show off another way to do that. There we go. So you can undo back there. If, for instance, I am working with a single terrain, and I come in here and I go, oh, I want to see what this looks like in Legacy Diffuse, right? So here we can see this chunk is in Legacy Diffuse. And I'm like, oh, and I need to get it back to MegaSplat. Now that we have this MegaSplat Terrain Manager, you can just hit the sync button, boom. It's just going to convert it right back. So that's another little thing that fell out of this in terms of usability. You really don't need these buttons very often. Whenever you edit a property of the source material, it's effectively calling sync all and syncing all the ones in the scene. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the terrain conversion stuff. I've been working on this a lot. I think it's getting pretty decent finally. Now, some of you might think, you know, why is this so hard or whatever? But MegaSplat uses a very, very different technique than what Unity uses. And, you know, often in computer graphics or in computer science in general, when you need to scale, when you need to go from, say, 4 or 8 textures to having hundreds, it means an entirely new technique, right? So with that comes very different formats and very different ways of looking at data. So here we have a little terrain I quickly generated in World Machine. This is using the Unity standard Lambert, whatever it is, the Legacy Diffuse shader. And so you can see it just does these big blurry cross blends between the terrains, and there's no real interaction or anything. But this may be the terrain you're working with right now, right? So I want to talk a little bit about some of the new options in the terrain converter and what they can do for you. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm actually just going to sync back to the MegaSplat version here. And here we see the output of just a basic terrain conversion. So if I go into the terrain converter and I select my config, you can see I used the MegaSplat textures for actually texturing the terrain. I'm going to select the moss. I'm going to select this one, the shore sand, and then for this one we're going to do those rocky cliffs, and then finally, there it is, some sand. So convert, so we're working with the right data. It's going to convert our terrain. I'd like to move this conversion process to the GPU. I think that would make it very, very fast. It'll be a lot of work to do it. Now, so if you were familiar with how this looked, say, you know, a month ago, I can show you kind of what it would have looked like. We're going to go to a component here, and we're going to make this into a one-layer shader. So most of the improvements require a two-layer shader. So if you're using a one-layer shader, I don't think a lot of these are going to apply to you. I've actually seen some very impressive results with people using a one-layer shader, which is kind of amazing. It can definitely be done, but it is a very different texturing process. Two-layer shader lets you get a little closer to the traditional process. So a little while ago, I think the terrain converter would look much more like this. And, you know, again, if you have enough textures and you kind of do enough work, you can certainly get this to look great with just a single layer. But I'm going to actually switch back to this two-layer, and what you'll see is that the converter in its conversion has managed to maintain much more of that blending data. So in this area here, which was this big blurry area where these two terrains intersected, you can see that it is done a much wider intersection area between these two terrains, and we have all this lovely detail of these two surfaces being blended via their height maps so that the sand appears in the cracks of the other surface. And according, you know, if we adjust our interpolation contrast here, you're going to get sort of a very different look between these two surfaces, and sort of which one wins, and you know how much they sort of blend together. But overall, I think this is doing a much better job than it was. So it took a little bit of work to figure out sort of how to best preserve this gradient information and use it But while I was doing that, I was doing a bunch of experiments with the data and trying to think of things that would not only make it look better, but may help conversion on an existingly painted terrain. So one of the problems you have is that you might have already made your terrain in another program, and you may have all had it all tuned, and you really tailored your generation or painting of that terrain to the shader you had. And if you had a big blurry shader, well, chances are you didn't have really wide blur areas. What you had was really tight blur areas where it would transition from one terrain to another because you're having the opposite problem, right, where the blur doesn't look good. If we go back to our terrain creator here, there is an option up here called blend blur. And all this does is apply a blur before we process this terrain to the actual data. It does a Gaussian blur. I think it's a 13 tap Gaussian. And it'll blur it, and that'll guarantee that you have a bunch of areas where there's going to be transitions. Now you'll notice that the sand immediately popped up the hills, and that's because the little patches in between, when they get blurred, things get darkened, and so they lost some of their energy, which means that they were reduced, and the sand was such a big, strong present focus in that area that it just took over. So there's actually this contrast slider on each of these, which if you turn that down, it will recover some of that area, and it'll bias sort of against the sand. And so now we can see we've kind of gone back somewhere to the original line. So you can play with that. If you find that one texture, due to its height information, is sort of dominating another, it'll let you play with that in the conversion process rather than going back to your textures and tweaking them. So another thing that we can do is in the blurring area, we can say, normally what's going to happen is you're going to have this big linear blur across the surface, and so it's going to go slowly from one terrain to another. Well, MegaSplat looks particularly good when it is in that sort of middle blending where you see little rocks and things coming through from the layer below. So if I convert with this blend biasing turned up significantly, what that's actually going to do is try to keep the terrain blending more. Put this back to 1, and I'm actually going to turn off our blur because our terrain has plenty of blur, so that's not really the problem with it. And so here you can see that now, when we've done this conversion, because of that blend biasing up, those places where we had little bits of rock coming through actually are sort of increased. So if I turn that down, you can see the difference. You'll see some of these rocks go away that were in the pathway. And so what it's trying to do is bias this towards 0.5, the middle blend. So which things win is going to be dependent on your height map information, but this can help get more blending, which is usually a better thing for the MegaSplat terrain conversion, or really just a more even blend. So yeah, the other stuff is mostly old. I showed off the second texture cluster feature. I did add some stuff to that and tweak it a little bit. So if I just set this up, I'm going to set up, let's just put some of these, don't put sand in the sand, this rocky soil here. And what this does is say, hey, if you're mostly sand, then when you do the conversion, start mixing in some of this rocky soil. And depending on your settings, you'll get more or less of it. So like this is obviously a lot of it. Now we can play with this. We can turn the noise frequency down, maybe like 0.2, and redo it. And what we'll see is we'll get a larger patterning now. There we go. So now we have like a larger patterning. And then we can play with this slider to say what the minimum and maximum amount of this texture appearing is. So if we sort of decrease the top and lower down the beginning, then this texture is not going to come through nearly as much. And we're going to get little bits of it appearing. And we might say like, hey, this is a little too hot up here, but it's a little too patchy now. So maybe we pull up the bottom, take down the top, and sort of hone in on that blend so that we get some interesting detail, but it's not not too sharp. Put that down a little more. And this will be really nice if it's on the GPU too, because it'll be instant. And so now we have these little patches in here, and we can play with this further. Oops. And kind of, polish this. But then one of the new features is the noise seed. So if I set this to some value, I call it a seed. It's really an offset into the noise, but it's sort of a multi-directional offset. It just sort of adds and subtracts. And so basically it acts as kind of a seed where the patterns will now be in different places depending on what I put in this. 71, and yeah, so you'll get different patterns each time. So if you don't like the particular pattern you have, you can change it, and you can also play with these sliders here to control how much of it appears and what size this patterning is. I tend to like these things on sort of wide swaths, so like this, where you get like a little bit of this coming in some areas. So so yeah, that's basically it for terrain. I think I've covered everything. I can go over the list if you're still watching. So yeah, multi-tile conversion, setting up the flows, the blurring of inputs in the terrain converter, the per texture contrast settings in the terrain converter, the noise seed, talked about that, the new way that it converts that helps keep those gradients. Oh, I made it so that projecting the tangents, if you're using projected UVs, you now have a choice of whether you want to use the mesh tangents or the projected tangents. And that's actually important if you're doing alpha layer stuff where you're painting on a house. You don't want to use the projected tangents, but in cases where you're texturing in world space, you want to use the projected tangents. We did the snow and the distance resampling. Oh, I did some tweaks to the vertex painter for people. Presets for macro textures, and the new geo vertical map. I think that's everything in 1.14. Fixed some various bugs, which is great. I continue to spend more time testing than anything else because the package is so large at this point that testing is just, it's a lot of work. All right, so I think that's it for this update. Hope you're having some fun, and I'll be back with another one at some point. Thanks.